All right. Hey, welcome everybody. Um, so I'll say thank you to Jordan and his team for putting all this together. This has been really great so far, and I agree with everybody in the Discord channel. Kind of hoping that sticks around. That seems like a great resource. So if there's discussion about leaving that channel up for a while or leaving that server up for a while, it's got my vote. My name is Mark Ernest. I'm a principal consultant with IdentityWorks LLC, and I've been working in identity and access management now for close to 2 decades. Prior to getting into consulting, I worked for Pennsylvania State University and did some identity and access management work with them. And then over the course of my career, I've done a lot of work with various industries, various verticals. My time at Ontology, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then for the last little over 11 years now, IdentityWorks. And during that time, I've always bounced back and done work at higher education. It's been one of the kind of constants that I keep coming back to. And lately, we've been doing a lot of work with them. They're a very unique environment. They are extremely complicated in some ways. And many times you're coming from an environment that is extremely homegrown and has a lot of very kind of quirky requirements. And one of the ones that we're going to talk about today is multiple authoritative sources and the challenges involved in matching and merging identities with those. Let's see. I hope my slide deck is being shared. It doesn't look like it is. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Okay, you guys are on the ball. All right, so let me just jump into this. So the challenge we have is an environment where we have, as I said, an identity that exists in multiple authoritative sources. So oftentimes lacking a foreign key or any kind of easy correlation between them, and frequently imperfect data to build correlation rules. Names spelled differently, birthdays incorrect, things that you would normally use as potential identifiers may not be right. So we're stuck with a lot of fuzzy matching and oftentimes a lot of cleanup whenever things go wrong. Higher ed is a good example of this. It's one that I've done a lot of work in, and it's the one that I will be using as an example for a lot of today. But this applies, in my experience, to healthcare as well, and several other industries. So it's a challenge that it's not unique to higher ed, but it is one that I believe most higher ed institutions face. So there's a couple of aspects to this, right? So you have your matching logic, and that needs to be flexible enough to support multiple rules covering multiple attributes. And as I mentioned, kind of fuzzy logic, and we'll get into sort of what that means later. Manual matching, so there's never going to be a perfect solution to this. When we talk about an HR system and one or more student systems and an alumni system, there's almost never going to be a way to merge the identities from those authoritative sources and have a perfect correlation to distill that down to a single identity. There's always going to be your edge cases where it's too close to call, or potentially there's just not enough data necessarily to make a definitive decision that this identity belongs with this person, or this is a brand new identity and should be created as such. And so in those cases, they get held as what we're going to call a partial match situation, where it requires manual intervention to go into and look at and figure out how to solve that problem. Performance is a must in this context. Higher education, and also, I guess, healthcare as well, in many cases, is going to be onboarding and offboarding a lot of people frequently. So think about a university that maybe has hundreds of thousands of students. Their undergrad population is going to completely cycle generally every 4 years. You're going to have a lot of people being loaded in one shot whenever they do loads for things like early admission decisions. Applicants sometimes get dumped into the student information systems en masse and then brought in, and so there's oftentimes timing around that where it needs to happen quickly, and we can't build something that takes a very long time to process. And then auditability is important as well. Any of the decisions that are made for matching, whether it's done by the algorithm or manually, definitely need to be tracked and audited. I'm going to throw this out there too real quick while I'm thinking about it. I am tracking the SailPoint IIQ stage channels. I got a little tablet here next to me I'm looking at. So if anyone has any questions real time, I'm actually used to giving presentations in front of people and kind of, having that back and forth and seeing feedback. So just sitting here talking on my computer screen is a little unnerving in a way. Not used to doing webinars, but So yeah, I will be tracking that. If you got any questions, feedback, or anything like that, let me know, and I'll kind of periodically take a look at that. And I will be around for the rest of the day too, as well, to answer questions and talk about this. So there's a couple of alternative approaches to the one that I'm going to throw out there. MDM software is one that we've seen a few times. Informatica is an example of this. Lumen Data is a company that partnered with Oracle many years ago to create software specifically for this. I want to say it was called Higher Education Constituency Hub. The fact that I don't exactly remember the name kind of tells you how successful it was. I don't see that being used very often. What we normally see, and what everybody tends to use right now, or rather what everybody has sort of built on their own, is a homegrown identity registry. That's a common concept in higher ed. It's been touted by different consortiums, Internet2, EDUCAUSE, various universities have gotten together and kind of built them around various platforms. So there's been ones that I've seen built on the Oracle platform stack. There's been ones that I've seen built homegrown in Perl. And for those of you who haven't worked in higher education before and think you know what technical debt is, I've also seen ones that are written in natural database running on an IBM S390 mainframe. So full on provisioning tool, matching and merging data, reaching out to downstream systems and provisioning accounts and managing them. That was an interesting one to replace. I actually started off as a mainframe systems programmer at Penn State, so I did have some good background knowledge to be able to dig in and understand how that worked. And then we've also seen just some really interesting, quirky environments. One that comes to mind is one that used LPR, the printer spooling protocol, as a transport mechanism for provisioning operations. And when we built a provisioning solution in there, migrated them off of their homegrown, there were components of that we still need to connect with. So a tool like IIQ that's super flexible and able to support a wide variety of connectors, and that's able to be extended via plugins, which is ultimately what I'm going to be talking about today, is super useful. Other approaches would be managing IDs separately. This is actually something that we did at Penn State when I was there at the turn of around 2000. And so what happened there is, if you're a student, you may have an identity, and then if you get hired on as an employee, you would receive a second identity, second email address. You would log in with a different username, different password. There's pros and cons to that, and that's probably worth an entire discussion on its own, because there are issues around what access you should retain after you're no longer a student versus what access you should retain if you're no longer an employee. We start talking about things like, for example, hey, PSU IQ admins are in the audience. That's excellent. All right. I do know a couple of guys there. Phil Pictionary is one of the people I worked with way back in those days. And so, yeah, anyone from Penn State that's there, just say hi. Saw that in the channel there. So yeah, actually what I'm specifically thinking of is and you can probably look it up in the system, my student ID was MAE155, and then when I was hired on as an employee, I was MXE20. The specific reason in that case was actually because our mainframe system didn't allow usernames that were 6 characters long, so I needed a 5-character username. But yeah, that's cumbersome. It's an end user nightmare. I still have seen it done in some environments though. And then reactive matching, and this I sort of alluded to this earlier, but this would be where you're doing a best effort at auto matching with a bias toward creating a new account. Because if there's any question, you would rather end up merging 2 accounts after the fact. All right, Phil Pictionary is here. How you doing, Phil? There's a bias towards creating a new identity rather than having to break apart an identity that was improperly matched with someone else. That's obviously no fun. It's manual, it's slow, it's human resource intensive, but again, I do still see it done in places. So this approach is a matching and merging plugin. And so I will go over some of the plugin concepts that have been discussed earlier today, as well as just show the way that we've implemented this particular plugin. We're making calls directly into the classes via correlation rules. We are making API calls through the AngularJS UI that we've written that goes through and does the matching and merging logic and queries for match cases. And then let's see, so as I said, it distills identities. If I get sidetracked, it's because I see chat and just want to make sure there isn't a question. This distills identities from multiple authoritative sources down to a single identity object. So it has to contain the logic for multiple source matching. It's basically a pluggable framework that lets you define what fields are used for matching. And then if you need to go and make calls out to external systems to do fuzzy matching logic or to do name normalization, there's capability to do that. Again, it's not a completely pluggable environment in that it still involves writing code, because there really isn't going to be an easy one-size-fits-all for this, but we've tried to make it as flexible as possible for the places that we've implemented it. Callable from any authoritative sources correlation rule. So when we have multiple authoritative sources, we want to make sure that they're all basically invoking the same matching and merging logic. It supplies the UI for manual matching and merging. And along with that UI, the ability to search and to delegate who is responsible for this. So for example, you may have, there's the client that I'm working with right now, whenever identities come in, they initially go to a kind of an IAM accounts team that will then dole them out to the proper people, usually the system owners or the data stewards for those systems, to actually decide, is this actually a new person or should this match to an existing person? The remediation for that can be done in the UI. You could use the UI to create a new user or to match it to an existing user. It'll show the candidates. This will make more sense when I show the UI as well, but it'll show the candidates that it can connect to. Or the data could be corrected in the authoritative source system and reaggregated if that's the proper way to go. So it may be that the reason an account wasn't properly matched was because a name was misspelled or an identifier was entered incorrectly. And so rather than sort of forcing that solution, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to actually map it, correct the data at the source system. Yeah, so there's some good discussion, and I will actually be talking about this further on, about national identifiers. So a lot of universities in the 90s, 2000s use SSN for everything. There were a few very high profile data leaks that happened. And so a lot of universities moved away from that, generally creating a different similar 9-digit number. And then, on top of that, then you have the issue of making things more global. So a lot of universities began opening up classes virtually, or even opening up physical locations outside of the US where SSNs aren't a thing. And so that can no longer be used as a guaranteed authoritative, unique identifier. And then some of us would argue that it probably should have never been used as such in the first place. But again, that's a whole different session. The other thing about this is it's going to allow for notification whenever things are delegated. It'll allow for notes to be added to cases, so that those can be tracked and discussed as they go through the process. And then ultimately, whenever a decision is made, it should insert an audit event that can be traced back to whoever made that decision, or if it was designed programmatically, you can see why it was designated that way. Try to utilize native IdentityIQ objects whenever possible. So custom objects. The identity object itself we use as a temporary holding for these partial match cases that I talked about. Whenever an identity comes in and it's not actually being assigned to a person yet, it's being held, we assign it to a temporary identity that we create ephemerally just for that purpose. And then the link is assigned to that, the application link is assigned to that account. And then we utilize the IdentityIQ plugin tables for any additional match metadata that need to be stored as well. So the rationale for this approach is the desire to move away from homegrown and or disconnected solutions. Having the solution as part of the identity tool is very useful. You've got all of your identities there for purposes of research. Moving away from a homegrown solution is generally just the movement that a lot of these places have done, and the preferred end user experience of maintaining a single identity and log on with the university, so not creating separate accounts, seems to be the way to go. And yeah, there's a lot of good discussion going on in the IQ chat. I kind of wish I could be following that, but I'm on camera. Single interface for accounts management team and help desk to cover all aspects of account creation. That's kind of key here as well. I've come into places where this has been scattered across multiple different tools, and it's relatively difficult to build a cohesive process where you've got to log into this system, research this, log into this system, fix that. So having it all centralized in one place is super useful, and being able to build out custom UIs with the identity plugin framework in IdentityIQ is kind of key to that. The ability to utilize existing matching and merging logic. So when I talk about coming into an institution and replacing a homegrown provisioning tool that handles all aspects of identity creation, assignment of usernames and other identifiers, determining roles, determining what access you should get. That's generally a fairly invasive and involved process, especially for, and I'll tell you, in most cases, the rationale and the impetus behind replacing the homegrown solution is the guy who wrote it is either about to retire or has just retired. And I know a lot of you at universities are probably nodding your heads right now, because that's usually what ultimately triggers change and what forces the decision to go to a commercial solution versus a homegrown solution is kind of seeing when that technical debt check comes due. So the ability to utilize existing matching and merging logic is key, because while we're doing all of that disruptive change, going through and drastically re-architecting what has been probably decades of decision making into what fields and what logic from each of these source systems constitutes a match, changing that is usually off the table. There are different ways to do this, and one of the ways to do this would be to completely scrap the idea of doing it in the identity tool, bring in a separate tool specifically for it, or look at a higher, a much larger initiative of maybe merging those data sources together into a single commercial package. But that's usually off the table for something like this. Generally, universities are going to be doing things as they have the funding to do it, and in stages, rather than trying to replace an entire identity infrastructure at once. So we live in the world that we have there, and have to deal with that. One of the things I didn't mention, and I think Danny brought up in the chat there, that actually made me think of this is, I mentioned the sources being things like a student database and an HR system, but also consider potentially universities that have multiple student databases. I'm working with a university now that has 4, it's actually a university system of 4 separate universities. Each maintains their own banner system. But also think about maybe non-traditional entry points of identities. So, there may be universities that are doing things like offering summer classes, non-credit, continuing education, summer camps, maybe hosting conferences where they're bringing in identities of faculty and staff from other places that may have had previous existing relationships. You want to be able to link those identities together and not constantly be creating new ones all over the place. The auditors really don't like that. And then, of course, performance. That's one of the key things, being able to do this quickly, and not just matching and merging in real time quickly, but also providing an interface that allows for the account administrators to handle those cases very quickly. This is a high-level flow diagram of what this looks like in an IIQ world. This is logic that we build out for several different provisioning tools. Obviously, IIQ is the one that we are using these days. And in fact, I'm going back and replacing a lot of legacy, not just homegrown solutions, but other legacy tools that I've put in place from other unnamed vendors that I get to go back. And speaking of technical debt, it's always fun when it's your own technical debt, something you built 10 years ago. So here we see an incoming record. This is an aggregation event going through a customization role. I'll get into why in a minute. But what we use to kind of make this work fast is link named attributes. So the customization role basically populates those before it gets to the correlation role. Normally those would be populated on a refresh, but I want the correlation role to be able to look at those and see them. So we do that in the customization role. Correlation role is really where everything happens here in an automated way. That's where we're going to call out to our plugin and basically decide, does the identity belong to an existing user? Does this belong to, should this be a brand new user, or is it too close to call? And I sort of show the 3 options there. If it's an existing record could mean that it's a banner system entry. We have a PIDM from it. That's the unique identifier used within Banner. We have a link object out there that's already assigned to a user with that PIDM. So that's easy. We link it up. We don't have to go through and do fuzzy matching logic. We already have that link object out there. Simple correlation. It may be a case where this is a brand new person in the Banner system, but they already existed in an HR system. So that's where we're going to go through and actually do the sort of matching roles to figure out, does this belong to this user or not? And if it does, and I'll get into exactly how that works in another slide here. But if it does, we link it up. Very simple, traditional IIQ. Link the link object gets assigned to the identity object, and the identity flag, identity refresh flag gets set, and everything continues as normally does. In the event that we go through and determine it's a partial match case, so maybe it's matched multiple identities, or perhaps it hasn't gone through and matched anyone definitely on the matching rules, but the second subset of partial matching rules, it's matched one or more. That's not good enough to form a definite link. So in that case, what we do is we put it into a partial match case. And that's where I'll be spending some time talking about how we populate some tables to track that, and how we provide an interface for allowing that to be managed. And then the last one, of course, is if you've gotten through everything and it's not been a match, it's not been a partial match, it's a new identity. Create a new identity, assign the link to it, same way you normally would do. So I'm going to set up kind of a hypothetical environment here. We do have a simple demo that'll sort of show you how this works and what it looks like. So we basically have, imagine an IIQ environment. You've got a student information system database, an employee database. We just put two database tables into the plugin schema. I'm not standing up separate environments for this, but it functions the same way. It's a database connector. It's running an aggregation. One of the key here is that we're using common attributes for matching logic. So things like name field, maybe gender identification is utilized, birthday, SSN if available, university ID. So oftentimes we'll find where when data entry is done, they may know that this person has already been there, and they can enter in that kind of universal university ID into the record. And we can use that to short circuit some of the matching logic, knowing that that's already been, in a sense, pre-matched. I'm looking at the channel, and it looks like there is a very long discussion on SSN, which I think I inadvertently sparked. So I'm looking forward to reading that in a few minutes. In addition to the attributes that we have there, these common attributes will be represented by named link attributes. I mentioned that to facilitate the matching logic. I think that's all I need to talk about on this environment here. So we'll talk about the rules. Correlation and customization rules, fairly straightforward. Rather than try to show you code on the screen, I'm just going to drag an IDE in here. For those of you who are attending this one instead of the Identity Now one where they're showing off VS Code, we also have a connector. So this is actually VS Code. This is what I use to build all this. And there's a halfway decent IIQ connector that I've been using for this last project. Pretty impressive. I am hoping that the Eclipse plugin gets open sourced, and maybe something could be forthcoming for the IntelliJ solution as well. But it's good that there's multiple ways to do this. So real quick, I'll jump through some of these just as an example here. I know this is going to be tough to see, but this is a standard JDBC connector for an employee source and a student source. I'll show you what those tables look like in a minute. And then what we also have here is we have some basic rules. So the employee correlation rule, what that's going to do, actually, let me jump in the correct order. The customization rule is just calling a method to populate the named attributes. I've got a rule library that does that. This is fairly straightforward IIQ code. Nothing I don't think any of us have seen before here. So we populate those, and then when we get to the actual correlation rule itself, we can take that data and pass it into, now this, we talked about invoking classes from IIQ that are in plugins. This matcher class exists in a plugin. So this is basically just instantiating this matcher object with the application, the account data itself. False is a flag to say whether or not it should actually match or not. We can use that for debug purposes. And then we basically call the match method here, and it returns an object as a virtual object that also exists within the plugin itself. And then we can use that to determine who it should be matched to. It'll always be matched to somebody. The identity is either going to be matched to a brand new user that the plugin created, it'll be matched to an existing user that didn't have a link for this object before, or it will be matched to a temporary partial match object, which will be used to hold it while the admin takes a look at it. And then I have similar ones also for student, but they basically look the same. There's nothing really different there. So correlation rule will be similar for each authoritative source. The rule will normalize data if necessary and call a common match routine in the plugin. And then I mentioned each invocation of that will result in a positive match. So the customization rule used to populate the link attributes. I guess I really covered all this. I don't need to read a slide out loud. Plugin, at a high level, it's going to perform the following functions. It's the engine for parsing and matching, parsing the matching rules that are stored in a custom object and performing matching logic when invoked from a correlation rule or a UI or a scheduled task. We have multiple ways of invoking this. And so to show that real quick, let me just jump down into the plugin itself. So we have matching rules. These are extremely simplistic, basic matching rules. Normally what we implement is going to look much more complicated than this. It's going to have additional fields. There's going to be more different rules for matching, more different rules for research, but these are the two that the key here. So this is positive match. You get through this, and again, understanding that this is very U.S. centric with SSN and or any real national identifier, but think of it as just a basic for instance, so that I'm not going through and detailing really complicated logic. The idea here is these are link attribute named fields. So it's going to query the link attributes that are marked authoritative for anyone who matches these. If we find one that matches on SSN and first name and birthday, and incidentally, SSN is normally going to be hashed in such a way that it's not stored in clear text, but still searchable. So we're not doing that. That's probably a bad idea if anyone is considering that. If it finds one and only one match rule, then that's a match. And it will stop at that point and it will continue on. Having said that, if it finds a match role, but it finds that match role, the identity that it matched to already has a link object of that type. So for example, if we link to an account that already has an employee record, then that automatically becomes a partial match. We're not going to automatically link that and overwrite an existing authoritative source. So one of the kind of rules with the way that at least we've set this up is that you can only have one entry per authoritative source. We don't want to go crazy here. Multiple entries and multiple authoritative sources is bad enough. Research rules are a little bit less complicated, a little bit simpler, but they're not positive matches, right? If we've matched on first name and birthday, might be the same person, probably. It's tough to say, so we're not going to create a new user in that case, but we're also not going to link it up to that user. We're going to have that be a manual decision process. The tweaking of these rules is something that universities generally have been doing over a long period of time and will continue to do as data fields change, as the reality of what data is available changes. And so, again, that's probably beyond the scope of this discussion as to, getting into all the strategies involved there. And you can actually see down here where I have the columns named in this object, right? So normally we would do named columns for these, but in this case, I'm just using the extended ones. I'm going to pause for 1 second and just take a look at, okay, so Devin Rosenbauer is doing a lot of talking here. Good, that means I don't have to worry about this. Thank you, Devin. Devin will handle the questions while I'm talking. And then we also have the kind of columns. I call them PIDM columns here, but that's just specific to the university I was most recently working with. University ID, employee ID. These are basically where we store on the identity record itself the identifier that they have for whatever authoritative source they're currently linked with. And that way we know if they already have one, it becomes real easy in our code to check that. So it also manages the IdentityIQ schema tables that store the metadata around partial matches. And I'm not going to dig too far into that because I am trying to be cognizant of time. The session that I am most interested in is coming up next. I'm looking forward to seeing Mike's talk on Angular and how that's set up. But I will show you real fast. Like this is an example of the schema that we have for match cases. We store a case name, and you'll see this when I go through and do the demo, but we generate a case name, the identity that it's currently attached to, a hash of all the match data that's associated with it. I don't need to read through all these. It's fairly obvious what this is storing, but we try to store as much as we can in this. Incidentally, we also store the history of this. So every time we do a new aggregation and it brings in different data, we'll track a history of it so that we can see that the data changed over time. May still continue to be a partial match case, but we're going to then allow it to to track that. All the inputs, basically, this is a giant blob of the data that came in on the aggregation for that source. Who it's assigned to, I didn't get into this too far, but we do build a framework to allow this to be assigned to different work groups or individuals to track and to manage and ultimately complete. Notes can be attached to them. We track if it's a manual match. There's some things there that, again, in the interest of time, I don't want to delve too deeply into, but I did want to show this real quick. So this is just an example of what we'll be pulling from. And again, interest of simplicity, I'm only going to pull a single record from each of these to kind of show how this works. But this is a hypothetical table of fake data that we use for validating and testing connectors and logic like this. We have an HR one, we have a student one. We have way more data in here than I'm getting into, but you can imagine, you may be building logic that looks at address information and maybe normalizes it and validates as part of your matching logic for that. The other thing that'll do is provide the user interface for administrators to review, delegate, notate, ultimately finalize the partial match cases. by assigning them to existing identities or creation of new identities, and also contains scheduled tasks to perform cleanup, reaggregation, and rematching of partial match cases. So let me give you a quick example why that's necessary. As I'm sure all of us know, whenever you're aggregating data from a source in IIQ, if you're aggregating a ton of data, and again, we're talking student systems that may have hundreds of thousands, millions of records of them, you're going to want to be optimizing those. The downside to that is because this matching logic is only invoked in a correlation role, if the object is optimized, it's not going to rerun the logic. And where that becomes an issue is in the case of the university I mentioned before, where I've got multiple universities, different banner systems for the same university system. We're distilling down to the same identity that's shared across those universities. If someone maybe applies to two of them at the same time, both of them get made match cases. An administrator goes through and says, yep, this is a new user, and creates it. Reevaluating that second one would then link it up with that account that was just created. But that won't happen on a normal aggregation because none of the data has changed in the source. That data is going to be optimized. That aggregation event is going to be optimized, and we're not going to be able to go any further. So we do have a process that goes through and aggregates, it runs through and basically does a get object for each of the accounts that are currently in partial match state to see if they need to be reaggregated. Furthermore, the UI we built also, this is optional, but we've done this in some places where when you pull up the record, it'll automatically reaggregate it as well, so that as you're going through and systematically handling these, it reevaluates with respect to any changes you may have just made to the person in front of them in the list. We also want to clean up the partial match identities that are done, and then potentially clean up the data structures that I showed you that are stored in the plugins table. It provides various rights and capabilities required to access these functions. I have a very simplistic example set up, but you could go and get as granular as you like with the way that works. So matching logic, I don't need to spend much time on this. I think I've already covered this. There's really three outcomes. You have your complete match rules, a link. If a link object matches one and only one, then it's going to connect and create that link object and move on from there. If one and only one matches, but it already has a link object, then that's not going to link. That it already has an object of that type, then it's not going to match. It's going to become a partial match. The partial match rules get executed after the complete match rules, and in the event that the partial match rules come up with anything, it becomes a partial match event, gets created, becomes a manual process that needs to be dealt with. If it gets through all that without any matches, we have a new identity. I've already shown an example of what that looks like, so I don't need to do that. Partial match handling. So this is the plugin that builds us a UI for this. So this is a series of classes that are going to apply these matching rules. These rules are callable. Did I jump back in the wrong? I feel like I might have jumped to the wrong slide. Yeah, I've already covered this, so I don't need to discuss this. I think I might have moved a slide further in the slide deck here. Data storage, I did talk and show you about. So we're storing some additional metadata outside of what would be stored in an identity cube for these partial match placeholders. It could be held in the identity object itself, but this allows us to persist it after the match is closed because that temporary identity gets removed if the link is moved to an existing user. And then just to make things easier, if it's a new user, we do create a new user and then clean up the temporary user type partial match. So the additional metadata would be things like the match name, any link, the temp identity, the native identity, the blob of data that came in from the authoritative source, possible matches. So when I mentioned in this logic here where we have these different roles, if you hit one or more of these roles and it decides it becomes a partial match event, we actually write down why in a blob that happens so that the end user can, the account administrator can see, oh, this is a partial match because it linked up to this user on these three fields, or it may be positively linked up to this user on a match role, but they already have an account. And so we're not going to do that. We also store things like who the match is assigned to at any given time and any notes associated with the match. The usual workflow on these kinds of things is that they're going to be passed off to a data steward or maybe a team that's responsible for managing certain types of users, certain departments, and they'll be responsible for figuring out, oh yeah, this person does belong to this, and this account does belong to this person, and link it up. Or this data was just wrong, go back to the source system, fix the data, the next aggregation will rerun the match logic. That'll actually clean up this partial match case and link it up properly. So it is sort of self-cleaning in that regard. The interface I'll show next here. So it's custom UI written in AngularJS. Very interested to see what we need to rewrite it in next. We're already looking at some of the, I think Angular 15, Devin is, if he hasn't talked about yet in the channels, probably mentioned, we've been taking some of our plugins and moving it to that, but we're looking for some, official guidance from SailPoint on where that future direction is before we start pushing things like that out to clients. So currently it's AngularJS. And the design goals is to present an administrator with enough information to make the decisions and have deep links to more information as necessary. So we can deep link into identity records, view the link object data history, see all the notes associated with the case, allow for fast searching, navigation, resolution. During early admissions period and early decisions period, it's not unusual that there may be hundreds of these that get created on an aggregation. Depending on how fine-tuned the matching logic is, how much data is available for that matching logic. So your administrators may need to go through and very quickly either correct data or link these up or assign them to new users. And having a fast interface for that is key. Allow for delegation, again, important because of the amount that we sometimes face in these cases. And retain the historical audit information about previous operations and decisions. And of course, retain the IIQ look and feel. We don't want to send them to a completely different looking application to do this. It should all be self-contained. So this is an example of what it looks like. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I'm going to show you a real one in a couple minutes. But just as a quick basic idea, this is kind of, it's IIQ-ish. And then scheduled tasks. I talked about this already, so I can skip this. Reaggregation of partial matches. To force reevaluation of matching logic. New or changed users in the system may produce different outcomes. Clean up temporary matches after match resolution, clean up the partial match tables, and generate reports on these things. Future enhancements. So there's a lot of things that we're looking at for this kind of tool in the future. One of the ones that's not on here that probably should be is obviously Angular framework and where to go from there. More fine-grained access controls on the UI. We have this built in for some of our clients now. We're building it in kind of as necessary, but we want to be able to hide and show certain attributes, certain fields, maybe even certain match rules based on the user that's in question, the identity that's in question, where it came from, what attributes it has, but also the identity of the user who was viewing it at the time. So someone may not have permission to view certain attributes, or they may not have permission to view certain attributes of a certain population. And so being able to build that out is key. Automating the partial match assignment based on source, match type, link attribute data. So VIP levels may be routed to special processing queues. There's obviously a lot of possibilities there. Matching rules analysis. So this is something that universities tend to struggle with, but at the same time, they also have a lot of experience doing it. And that's basically, we have all this data in one place. We can watch all of this data in play and in flight and use it to fine tune our rules so that we get that, the amount that has to be handled manually down to a smaller percentage. The more automation that we can do, obviously, the better there. Standardized matching rule logic to be configurable entirely by custom objects. What I showed you was a custom object that shows very basic matching rules. It's pretty much just straight string comparisons. But what we want to be able to do is get to the point where we can maybe build modular components that call out to external fuzzy matching logic. And to answer a question, yes, the slides will be uploaded to the dev community. I apologize, I didn't do that ahead of time. I will do that today, though. And then the last thing I threw in there is external calls to fuzzy matching engines, maybe AI, maybe ChatGPT has a play in this. I'm sure that's got to send some privacy peoples into a panic, but who knows what the future holds for these kinds of operations. So let me give you a real quick demo on this. This is not going to be in any way indicative of the level of complexity that could be built here, but this is an example of a simple, let me reload it so that I actually get my login. Bitword's been acting weird lately. Okay. All right, so incidentally, and I'm going to pretend this was done on purpose to kind of do a callback to Paul's presentation. This is one of his widgets. Certainly done deliberately, not because I hijacked Paul's environment to do this demo. Don't know where anyone would have gotten that idea. You'll see here there's an unresolved records. So this is a simple card, quick link, and it just does a query to see how many current unresolved records exist in the system. There are none because there's really no users in the system yet. So let me just do some real quick aggregation. Let's say we run the student aggregation here, and now we're going to have an identity. Actually, I'll go back home. Still no unresolved records because we brought in our very first person, and you can see I've deleted this person, but there's still some cards there. So this is the person that was created, gave them a username, first name, last name, a student ID. In their application accounts, they have a specific, the student source data exists there. You can see that there's link attributes defined. So if there were to be an employee with the same name, but is potentially a different person, and we run an aggregation of that. By the way, the reason I'm doing this, I don't think I actually explained this properly here, but these aggregations are just doing simple, I'm grabbing a single account. I'm not pulling the entire thing at once in the interest of time. So that's why you only see one. So if I do an employee aggregation, I've run that now. Now, if I go back to the home, there's an unresolved record. So now we go into the plugin. And this is where this is a custom interface for searching. We can search by application. We can search by native ID. We can search by employee IDs. We can narrow it down by date. These cases have individual statuses that we can search by as well, or by case name. I'm just going to do a blind search. There's a single one there, single entry. So when I click on this, you get a little bit of information, the case name, the data source, unresolved records is who it's assigned to. That's an arbitrary work group that I created. And then here, now I can go down and actually take a look at this. Now it matches a single person. And if I click on this, it takes me into a new tab. That's certainly the student we just created. But I can come back here and say, I need to add some additional notes. Maybe I'm going to assign this to a group. So I'm going to assign it to the student group, the unresolved student group. Again, these arbitrarily created, but normally they're going to be aligned with the different teams that are responsible for managing these. So I could add some notes in here, and that test note suddenly becomes part of the, this becomes effectively a ledger of notes as it goes through the process. I can send an email to a group if I want to, and just hit notify. It'll send all the case notes and the current status of the match to maybe alert them that this is something they need to do. We see the assignment details in here. If this has been assigned to different groups, that history gets built up. Start going a little bit faster because I'm bumping up against time. But if I go through and say, you know what, this is a new person, created as a new person, I get a little warning about that, created as a new identity. And now when I look at this case, it gives me the details of the resolution, and it tells me that there is a new identity. I can go in here and view this new identity with the employee source. So if I come down here and actually do a search on Maxine now, I have two of them. One's a student, one's a faculty member. They were created that way based on the matching and merging logic and the manual creation of that. So I'll show you really quickly here while I have time. Incidentally, this account is the temporary placeholder account that was used for that partial match. That gets cleaned up by the scheduled task, but I'm impatient, so I'm just going to do it now. And if I go through and do effectively the same process, and I say I want to aggregate a student, and then I want to aggregate an employee, I'll come back here and I should have a single, yep, I have a new case, new unresolved record. But this time, instead of saying create as a new person, I'm going to match this to the existing user. Again, I get a warning, tells me what it's going to do. Confirm this match. And now I'm in a state where if I go back and look at this record, I see that there is a single person with both applications assigned, and whatever identity refresh needs to happen as a result of that, it will go through and do. What you've got now a student and a student and a faculty member maybe, and they're going to have obviously vastly different accounts that are provisioned based off of that, but that'll all be handled from here out. So yeah, I will. I'm up against time here. I will be sticking around in the channel to answer questions. I see Devin and Paul have actually been answering a lot of questions about this. So I wanted to thank everybody for attending.